The paper hit the table like a gunshot. Sadie Shepard stared at the number written in bold black ink across the top of the foreclosure notice, and for one breathless, suspended moment, the whole world went silent around her. $3,412. That was the sum total of everything she had ever built, everything she had ever loved, everything she had ever bled for, reduced to a cold debt figure on a banker's letterhead. The Shepard homestead. 47 acres of high country, Colorado grassland. A barn she had raised with her own 2 hands after a lightning fire took the first one. A herd of 17 horses that were so well trained they responded to whistle commands alone. And a modest but honest house that still smelled like her mother's lavender soap even after 3 years of being gone. All of it. Gone by the end of the month. Standing across the table from her, in the cramped sitting room of that house, was Howard Kane, the land agent for the Colorado Territorial Bank, and he wore the kind of smile that men wear when they already know they've won. He was broad-shouldered and neatly dressed in a way that felt obscene against the dust-worn walls around him, and he set his leather satchel down on her mother's favorite chair like he already owned it. "You've got 30 days, Miss Shepard," Kane said, smoothing his lapels. "Pay the debt in full or the bank takes possession of the land, the livestock, and all structures thereon. That's the law of the territory." Sadie did not flinch. She had not flinched at rattlesnakes or blizzards, or the day her father died face down in the north pasture, with a heart that had simply given out under the weight of too many hard seasons. She was not going to flinch now. "Get out of my house," she said very quietly. Kane picked up his satchel. He was already halfway through the door when he turned back, and his smile was the worst kind, slow and certain and tinged with something that bordered on pity. "The Keller Cattle Company has already expressed interest in the land," he said. "You might want to keep that in mind." Then he was gone, and the sound of his horse's hooves fading down the creek road was the loneliest sound Sadie had ever heard. She stood there for a long time after he left, her hands pressed flat on the table over that foreclosure notice, breathing through her nose, her jaw tight. The Keller Cattle Company. That name had rolled across the Colorado Territory like a thunderhead all summer. Stephen Keller, 32 years old, owner of the largest functioning cattle operation in the southern half of the territory. A man who had arrived from Texas 5 years ago with nothing but a reputation, a horse, and an iron will, and had since accumulated land and influence in a way that made older cattlemen nervous and younger ones envious. She had never met him. She had only heard about him in the way that people who live alone on homesteads hear about powerful men, through other people's mouths, through the conversations at the feed store and the dry goods shop, through the particular hush that fell over a room when his name came up. He was not a villain, people said. He was just unstoppable. Well, Sadie Shepard had stopped a lot of things that other people called unstoppable. She was 26 years old, and she had been running this ranch alone for 3 years. Before that, she had run it alongside her father for 7 more, learning every inch of the land and every mood of the sky above it. Her mother had died when she was 12, a fever that swept through the territory one brutal January, and her father had raised her the only way he knew how, which was to teach her everything. How to read the land for water. How to train a horse from the ground up, not with fear but with language, with patience, with a deep and instinctive understanding of how a 1,000-pound animal thought and felt. How to negotiate at market. How to keep books. How to survive. She was, by every measurable standard, the finest horse trainer in a 4-county radius, and she knew it not with arrogance but with the calm certainty of someone who had spent 20 years earning a skill with her entire body and mind. The debt had not been her fault, not entirely. A brutal winter had killed 6 horses. A summer drought had dried up 2 of the 3 creek-fed pastures. Her father had taken out the original bank loan to expand the herd 3 years before he died, and the interest had compounded in ways that Sadie had been fighting to outpace ever since. She had sold horses. She had taken on training contracts. She had worked herself down to 1 meal a day in leaner months and told herself it was fine. It was temporary. She was going to pull out of it. 30 days. She sat down at the table and opened her account ledger and stared at the numbers she already knew by heart. She had $420 in cash savings. She had 3 horses currently under training contracts, 2 of which would not be paid out until the fall. She had a 4th horse, her finest, a coal-black 3-year-old stallion she had named Absalom, who was not yet on any contract because she had been saving him. She had been saving him because she knew, in the quiet logical part of her brain that never stopped calculating, that Absalom was extraordinary. He was the son of her best breeding mare, and a stud she had borrowed from a rancher 2 counties over. And from the day he was born, he had shown a quality of intelligence and physical perfection that she had never seen in 20 years around horses. She had spent a year training him personally, and he was now capable of things that most horsemen would not believe without seeing them demonstrated. He would ground tie without a stake. He would cut cattle with no rider direction. He would respond to 14 distinct whistle commands and 3-hand signals. He was, to put it plainly, a miracle in horse form, and any serious cattleman in the territory would pay a fortune for him. But a fortune was not $3,400, not from a single horse sale. Unless. Sadie sat very still, and the thought formed the way the best thoughts did, slowly and then all at once, with a clarity that felt like cold water on a hot day. Unless she didn't just sell him. Unless she brought him to the one man in the territory who had both the money and the need, and she made a deal that was bigger than a sale. Unless she went directly to Stephen Keller and she laid everything out on the table and she proposed something that he would be a fool to refuse. She folded the foreclosure notice. She set it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest, where she could feel it as a reminder and not a defeat. She went to the barn. Absalom looked at her from his stall with those dark, liquid eyes that always seemed to be thinking something several steps ahead of whatever she was thinking, and she put her hand on his nose and felt the warmth of him, the steadiness of him, and she made herself a quiet, private promise. She was not going to lose this ranch. She was going to ride to the Keller spread at first light, and she was going to walk into the lion's den with her head up and her best horse at her side. And she was going to negotiate the most impossible deal that the Colorado Territory had ever seen. The morning she rode to find Stephen Keller was the kind of October morning that the high country did like no other place on earth, crystalline and cold and sharp with the smell of pine resin and coming snow, the mountains so vivid against the blue sky that they looked painted. Sadie had been up since before dawn. She had fed and watered her horses, checked the tack twice, braided her dark hair back tight under her hat, and put on her best riding clothes, which were still work clothes but were clean and pressed and left no doubt that the woman wearing them meant business. She rode Absalom herself, and the horse moved beneath her with that quality he had always had, like water flowing, like something inevitable and beautiful. His black coat catching the early light in a way that made even the deer in the meadow look up and watch him pass. The Keller spread was 12 miles south and east of her own land, set in a broad valley where Cottonwood Creek widened and the grass grew tall and thick. She had never been to it, but she had heard it described often enough to know what she was riding toward. A proper ranch house, 2 stories built from milled lumber rather than logs, a bunkhouse, a massive barn, corrals that stretched out for half a mile, and cattle, hundreds and hundreds of cattle, Hereford and Longhorn mixed, the best grazing animals money could buy. She crested the last ridge just after 9 in the morning and saw it below her, and it was, she admitted privately, everything people had said it was. It was the kind of operation that spoke of intelligence as much as money, the corrals arranged efficiently, the outbuildings positioned sensibly relative to wind direction and water access. Someone had thought hard about how this ranch worked, and it showed. She rode down. A ranch hand intercepted her at the gate, a young man of about 20 with a sunburned face and the cautious posture of someone who had been trained to ask questions before opening things. "Help you, ma'am." "I'm here to see Stephen Keller," Sadie said. My name is Sadie Shepard. I own the Shepard homestead up on Prospect Creek. I don't have an appointment, but I have something he's going to want to see before he makes any decisions about that property." The young man looked at Absalom, and his eyes widened just slightly, the way eyes do when they recognize something exceptional. He looked back at Sadie. "Wait here," he said, and went. She waited. She did not fidget. She sat straight in the saddle and let the sun warm the back of her neck and watched the activity of the ranch around her with the professional eye of someone who had spent a lifetime observing how well or poorly an operation was run. It was run well. She could see that from the gate. The horses in the near corral were in good weight, well groomed. The fences were sound. The yard was not cluttered. She heard him before she saw him, boots on hard ground, a stride that had authority in it, unhurried but purposeful. And then Stephen Keller came around the corner of the main barn and walked toward the gate, and Sadie had a moment of composure management that she was glad no one could see. He was tall. Not in the theatrical way of men who knew they were tall, but functionally tall, the kind of height that comes with proportion and solidity and looks completely natural on a man who has spent his life doing physical work. He had dark brown hair that was a little long under the brim of a worn work hat, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same sandstone as the canyon walls behind him. He was dressed in work clothes, canvas pants and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the cold, and there was a quality of absolute attention in his face as he approached her that she had not expected. Most men looked at the horse first. He looked at her first. "Miss Shepard," he said, stopping at the gate. His voice was low and even, a Texas accent worn smooth by years in Colorado. His eyes were a particular shade of dark gray that was almost blue in the mountain light. "Jake tells me you've got something I want to see." "That's correct," Sadie said, "but I'd like to speak with you directly, not across a fence." He considered this for exactly 2 seconds, then opened the gate. He stepped back and let her ride through, and as Absalom passed him, he turned to follow the horse's movement with his eyes, and Sadie caught the moment the professional appraisal began. She had seen men look at good horses her entire life. She knew what that expression looked like. Stephen Keller's expression was the version of it that belonged to someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. She dismounted in the yard, and he came to stand beside her, and for a moment they were both just looking at Absalom, and the horse, as if he knew he had an audience worth performing for, lifted his head and shifted his weight and stood with the natural elegance of something bred for exactly this purpose. "This is an extraordinary animal," Keller said, and the words were quiet and direct and contained no flattery, only accuracy. "Yes," Sadie said, "he is. His name is Absalom. He is 3 years and 4 months old, and he is the finest horse I have ever trained in my life. I am here to make you a proposition, Mr. Keller, and I want you to hear all of it before you respond." Something moved behind his eyes. Interest, maybe, or the particular alertness of a man who has learned to listen carefully to the things people say when they've ridden 12 miles in the cold to say them. "All right," he said. "Come inside. I'll have coffee brought." The ranch house was everything the outside suggested it would be, substantial and practical, and arranged by someone who cared about function over display. The main room had a large stone fireplace, a table that could seat 8, bookshelves with actual books in them. Sadie noticed the books and filed the observation away. A man who read was a man who could think beyond what was immediately in front of him. That was useful to know. They sat at the table. A woman who appeared to be a cook set 2 cups of coffee in front of them and disappeared without comment. Sadie wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth of it settle her, and then she laid out her argument with the precision of someone who had spent the previous night rehearsing every possible version of this conversation. "You know about my land," she said. "Howard Kane told me himself that the Keller Cattle Company has expressed interest in purchasing it from the bank after foreclosure, so you already know the situation." Keller's expression did not change. "I know the bank sent a notice," he said carefully. I made a general inquiry about available land in the area. I haven't made any offers. But you would consider it. A pause. The land borders my north pasture. It would make a significant operational difference to this ranch if it were part of the same operation. Yes, I would consider it. Good, Sadie said, because here is what I'm proposing instead. You don't wait for the bank to take it and sell it to you at a price that will benefit only Howard Kane and the Colorado Territorial Bank. Instead, you pay my debt directly, $3,412, and in return I give you full access to the north pasture for your cattle, the use of my water rights on Prospect Creek for 5 years, and I train horses for the Keller Cattle Company exclusively for those same 5 years, at a rate that accounts for the value of what I've already described, with the debt repayment as the advance against future earnings. At the end of 5 years, the land remains mine, the debt is cleared, and we renegotiate from a position of genuine partnership. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who hadn't been listening. It was the silence of a man running calculations at speed. That's a substantial amount of money to advance against unverified earning potential, Keller said. The earning potential is not unverified, Sadie said. It is standing in your corral right now. She watched his face. She watched the moment the calculation shifted from skepticism to genuine consideration, and she pressed forward before he could speak. I am going to demonstrate something, she said. Not because I need to convince you that Absalom is valuable. I can see that you already know he is. I'm going to demonstrate it because I want you to understand exactly what kind of horsemanship you'd be contracting for 5 years. And then you're going to understand why this deal is worth more to you than buying empty foreclosed land from a bank. They walked back out to the corral, and Keller brought 2 of his ranch hands along, and Sadie did not mind the audience. She had never minded an audience. What happened in the next 20 minutes was one of those things that people in the Colorado Territory would talk about for years afterward, not always getting every detail right, but always getting the essential truth of it correct, which was that Sadie Shepard put on a demonstration of horsemanship that left 3 grown men standing at a corral fence with their mouths open. She worked Absalom through the 14 whistle commands first, and each one was precise and immediate, the horse cutting left and right, stopping on a dime, backing up in a straight line, performing a perfect turn on the haunches, all from 20 feet away with no rope, no lead, nothing but the sound she made with her lips. Then she moved 3 of Keller's ranch horses into the corral, horses Absalom had never seen before, and she set Absalom to cutting them, working through a sequence she directed only with her body position and 2 hand signals, and the black stallion moved through those 3 horses with the intelligence and anticipation of a horse that could practically read minds. Then she did the thing she had been saving. She ground-tied Absalom in the center of the corral, walked to the far end, turned her back and whistled once, a specific long note that she had worked for 8 months to teach him. And Absalom walked to her, pressed his nose between her shoulder blades and stopped. She heard Stephen Keller exhale. She turned around, and the look on his face was the look she had been working toward, not the polite professional appraisal from before, but something raw and genuine and stunned. He was staring at the horse and then at her, and in his eyes was something she recognized as the specific shock of a man who has just seen something that has fundamentally revised his understanding of what is possible. "How long did that take to teach?" he asked, and his voice was different, the professional caution gone out of it, replaced by something quieter and more honest. "The whole command vocabulary took 14 months, Sadie said. That last one alone took 8. It requires a level of trust between horse and trainer that most people never build because they don't have the patience for it. I've been around horses my entire life," Keller said. "I have never seen anything like that." "I know," Sadie said. He looked at her then directly and without any of the transactional distance he had been maintaining since she arrived, and in that moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with horses or debt or deals, something that surprised them both equally and that neither of them was equipped to address yet. Standing in a corral in the cold October sun with two ranch hands pretending to look at the fence posts. Keller sent the ranch hands back to their work. He and Sadie walked back to the house. "Tell me the numbers again," he said. "All of them." She did. She had brought her ledger with her, tucked into her saddlebag, and she spread it on the table and walked him through 3 years of accounts with the same unflinching precision she brought to everything. The debts, the assets, the earning projections. She had written out a formal contract proposal the night before, by lamplight, referencing the standard terms used in territory livestock agreements and adjusting them to fit the specific arrangement she was proposing, and she slid it across the table. Keller read it. He read it slowly and carefully, which Sadie appreciated. She had encountered enough men who made decisions without reading documents to know that a man who actually read what was in front of him was a man worth dealing with. He asked 4 questions, specific and intelligent questions about water rights boundaries, about horse registration procedures, about the terms for renegotiation at the end of 5 years, and about what would happen to the arrangement if either party died or was incapacitated. Good questions. Questions that told her he was thinking about this as a real partnership rather than a charity transaction. She had answers to all 4. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she let him think. She drank her coffee, which had gone cold, and she did not push him because she had learned from 20 years around horses and people that the worst thing you could do when someone was on the edge of a decision was to crowd them. "I have a counter-proposal," he said. Her heart tightened. "Let's hear it." "The core terms you've outlined are sound," he said, "but I want to add a provision. Rather than framing this as a debt repayment against future earnings, I want to frame it as a capital investment. I pay the debt. The land remains yours. The water rights arrangement and the training contract stand as described. But the monthly payment structure isn't against the debt, because the debt will be cleared outright. It's against the fair market value of 5 years of exclusive training services and water access, which I calculate, based on current territory rates for both, to be approximately $4,800 over 5 years. Which means you would actually come out of this arrangement with a modest profit above the debt clearance, provided the horses you train perform at the level I observed today." Sadie stared at him. "That is a better deal for me than the one I proposed," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Why?" He met her eyes, and there was nothing complicated in his expression just then, only something direct and steady. "Because the deal you proposed was a fair one," he said, "and I would rather start a business arrangement with a fair foundation than an uneven one. Uneven foundations collapse eventually." She studied him for a long moment. "Most men in your position would have taken the land from the bank for less money and less complication. Most men in my position haven't seen what I just saw in that corral," he said, and something in the way he said it suggested that he was not talking exclusively about the horse. They shook hands on the agreement that afternoon. His grip was firm and unhurried, and her hand in his was smaller but no less steady, and neither of them let go for exactly a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Then they both seemed to notice, and they stepped back into professionalism with the careful choreography of 2 people pretending they hadn't just noticed something. He rode back with her to the homestead that evening, not because it was necessary, but because the territory sun was dropping fast, and the road between their properties had 2 creek crossings that ran high in the fall, and he said simply that he wanted to see the land he was investing in. She did not argue with this. She told herself it was purely practical. The ride was 12 miles of the most charged silence she had ever experienced. They were not silent in the way of strangers with nothing to say. They were silent in the way of 2 people who have too much to say and no safe way yet to begin saying it. The country moved around them in the fading gold of late afternoon, aspens shivering off their last leaves, the mountains going purple and orange in the west, the kind of beauty that made the chest ache for no reason you could name. He asked her once how she had started working with horses, and she told him the true version, not the abbreviated polite version but the full one, about her mother and the fever and her father's quiet grief, and the way he had taught her everything he knew because she was the only student he had left, and the way she had fallen into horses not as a choice exactly but as a calling, as something that felt more like recognition than discovery. He listened without interrupting. He asked smart follow-up questions. He looked at the road ahead of him while she talked, but she could tell he was listening with his whole attention, not just his ears. She did not ask him about himself that night. She would learn his story in pieces, later, over the weeks and months that followed, in the particular incremental way that real intimacy builds itself. What she knew by the time they reached her gate was that she was in a considerable amount of trouble, and it had nothing to do with the bank. The first months of the arrangement were a study in professional intensity and careful distance. Stephen Keller was not the kind of man who blurred lines, and Sadie Shepard was not the kind of woman who allowed them to be blurred. The terms of their contract were clear. She trained horses for his operation. He paid her monthly and maintained the clear debt agreement, and the water rights and pasture access were laid out in a written document that both of them had signed before Howard Kane and the bank, and made it all official and legal. The work itself was magnificent. She threw herself into it with everything she had, because the work was what she understood and what she trusted, and because she was not yet ready to examine too closely the other feelings that had arrived uninvited that October afternoon. He sent her horses in pairs, and she worked them individually, because that was how she worked, and the results spoke for themselves. Within 8 weeks, she had a Hereford cow horse that could work a full day without guidance from a rider, that anticipated cattle movement and responded to the herd's own behavior patterns in a way that made it 3 times more efficient than an untrained animal. She sent him back to the Keller ranch with a detailed training record, a set of commands, and a written instruction sheet for the hands who would ride him, because the horse was only as good as the communication maintained with him. Keller sent her a note in return. It said, "The hands are speechless. This is remarkable work." The note was brief and businesslike, and she read it 4 times. He came to the homestead to see the work in progress every 2 weeks or so, which was reasonable given the operational integration they had agreed to. And the visits were always professional, always focused on the horses, always conducted with the careful propriety of 2 adults who had a financial arrangement and nothing more. Except that Sadie's father had told her once that the things you felt most strongly about were the ones you worked hardest to pretend you didn't feel, and she had been thinking about that particular piece of wisdom more often lately than was strictly comfortable. She noticed the specific way he moved around horses, with the instinctive respect of someone who had grown up around them and loved them without sentimentality. She noticed the way he listened when she explained a training decision, with real attention, the way someone listens when they know the person speaking knows more than they do about something, and they want to understand it fully. She noticed the way he looked at her land when he thought she wasn't watching, the way his eyes moved across the pastures and the creek line and the mountains behind, with a quality in his expression that was something close to longing, though she couldn't have said exactly what he was longing for. She noticed too many things about Stephen Keller. The conversation that cracked them open to each other happened in December, 3 months after the initial agreement, during a snowstorm that moved in faster than either of them expected. He had come by on a Tuesday afternoon to return 2 horses she had loaned for a roundup and to discuss adding 2 more young animals to her training roster. They were in the barn when the snow hit, coming down hard and sideways with a wind that turned the world outside the barn doors into a white wall, and it was clear within 20 minutes that he was not riding 12 miles home in that. She offered him the spare room in the house without ceremony, because it was the sensible thing to do, and he accepted it the same way without drama or awkwardness, because they were both practical people. But then they sat down to supper, which was the venison stew she had been cooking all day, and the sourdough bread she baked on Tuesdays. And the fire was going, and the storm was roaring outside, and the lamps were lit. And the whole house had that particular feeling it got in a snowstorm of being the only warm thing in the universe. And something about the particular intimacy of that, the two of them alone in the light with the darkness pressing in from outside, made the careful professional distance impossible to maintain. He asked her about her dark past, not in those words, but with the gentleness of someone who has noticed evidence of hard history and wants to understand it. He asked her what it had been like, those 3 years of running the homestead alone. Really like. Not the practical version she gave in contracts and negotiations. She told him. She told him about the fear she had never admitted to anyone else, the specific terror that had come sometimes at night in the second year when the debt was growing and the horses weren't selling fast enough, and the isolation was a physical weight on her chest. She told him about the morning she had sat in the barn with her father's old ledger and faced the real numbers for the first time and understood that she might actually lose, that despite everything she was doing right, the mathematics of debt and drought and bad luck might simply defeat her. She told him about what had kept her going, which was partly stubbornness and partly the horses and partly the specific knowledge that her father had trusted this land to her. Not because she was his only option, but because he had believed she was the best person for it. Stephen Keller listened to all of this without saying a word, and when she finished, the fire had burned down some and the storm outside was still going, and the silence between them was the warm kind, the kind that holds rather than separates. "My father left me nothing," he said then, quietly. Not with bitterness, with the simple accuracy of someone stating a fact they have made their peace with. "He drank what he earned and then borrowed more to drink that, and when he died when I was 17 there was nothing left but the debt and the knowledge that I was not going to be him." Sadie looked at him. "How did you build all of this from nothing?" "Work," he said. 15 years of it. I started as a hired hand in Texas, worked my way up to trail boss, saved every dollar I didn't need for survival, learned everything I could learn about cattle and land and money. I came to Colorado because the land prices were still reasonable and the grass was better than anywhere I'd ever seen. He paused. And because I wanted to be somewhere I could build something that would outlast me, something that couldn't be lost to someone else's weakness. There was something raw in that last sentence, something he hadn't entirely planned to say, and she felt the weight of it, the hidden motive behind every careful decision he made, the shadow of a frightened 17-year-old boy who had promised himself he would never be left with nothing again. "You were afraid the same way I was afraid," she said. He looked at her, and there it was again, that thing that passed between them like light through a gap in clouds, sudden and warm and gone almost as soon as it appeared. "I suppose I was," he said. Neither of them slept particularly well that night, and neither of them mentioned the reason why. The real trouble started in January, and it did not come from any direction Sadie had anticipated. She had been expecting, privately, that the hardest part of the next 5 years would be the financial management, keeping her operation profitable enough to justify the ongoing contract, managing the interaction between her herd and Keller's cattle on the shared pasture, maintaining the water rights arrangement cleanly. Those were the problems she had planned for. She had not planned for Marcus Webb. Webb was a land speculator who had been working the southern Colorado Territory for 3 years, buying up distressed properties, holding them, and then selling them in parcels to the railroad interests that were pushing into the territory from the east. He was the kind of man whose surface charm was so carefully maintained that it took a while to see what was underneath it, which was a cold and systematic dishonesty that had ruined at least 2 other homesteaders before Sadie came to his attention. He showed up at her gate on a January afternoon with a smile and a story about wanting to buy horses, and left behind enough questions that she spent 3 days at the county record's office in town confirming her suspicions. What she found was that Webb had been in quiet communication with Howard Kane at the bank for months before the foreclosure notice had arrived on her table, and that the original escalation of her loan terms, the interest rate adjustment that had pushed her debt to an impossible number, had been triggered not by any legitimate banking review, but by a targeted assessment designed to push her into default on a timeline that matched Webb's acquisition schedule. In other words, the collapse of her finances had not been purely bad luck. It had been, in part, engineered. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before she told Stephen Keller. She told him because he was her business partner and had a right to know about anything that affected the stability of their arrangement. She told herself very firmly that this was the only reason. She rode to his ranch on a clear, cold morning in late January and told him everything she had found, spreading the copied records across his table in the same way she had spread her ledger 3 months before, and she watched him read through them. The change in his face was slow and then very sudden, and she understood in that moment that the thing she had most respected about him in those early months, his controlled, measured quality, was not the absence of feeling but the discipline of it. And when that discipline was breached by something genuinely unjust, what came through underneath was something intense and burning and very real. "This is documented," he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very level, which was somehow more alarming than anger would have been. "Thoroughly," Sadie said. "Kane deliberately manipulated your loan terms to force a default, so that Webb could acquire the land at distressed prices and hold it for railroad sale," Sadie said. "Yes." He sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was complex and had several layers moving through it, and one of those layers was something she had been watching grow and trying to ignore for 3 months now. "You found all of this yourself," he said. "I spent 3 days in the county records office," she said. "The documents are public record if you know what to look for." "Most people wouldn't know what to look for. Most people haven't been keeping their own books and fighting a bank for 3 years," she said. "Sadie." Her name in his voice was different from how it sounded in her own head, and she felt the difference with an immediacy that was slightly alarming. "What do you want to do with this?" "I want to take it to the territorial attorney's office in Denver," she said. "The fraudulent loan adjustment is a criminal matter under territorial banking law. I looked up the statutes. Kane can be prosecuted for it, and Webb loses his ability to acquire the land because the mechanism by which it was made available to him was illegal." There was a long silence. "You want to go to Denver," Keller said. "I want to go to Denver," Sadie confirmed. He went with her. They made the 4-day journey to Denver in early February, taking the stage from Pueblo because the mountain roads were still dangerous with ice, and neither of them was foolish enough to push horses through that. 4 days in the close quarters of stage travel and the boarding houses along the route. 4 days of proximity and shared meals, and the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people with naturally aligned minds are given enough time and enough space to follow their thoughts wherever they lead. They talked about everything, about the future of the cattle industry in Colorado and whether the railroad would help or harm the small operations along its route, about the particular quality of high country light in winter, about the books on his shelves she had finally asked, and he had revealed a genuine and unpretentious passion for history and geography, Lewis and Clark, and the journals of mountain men, the kind of reading that was less about escape and more about understanding the nature of the country they lived in. About her horses, because she never stopped thinking about her horses, and he asked questions that were increasingly sophisticated as the days passed, learning her language, which was the language of animal behavior and patient observation. They talked about loneliness. Not directly, not with that word, but around and through it, in the way that people discuss things that are too large and close to address head-on. He mentioned once carefully that there was something about the homestead, her homestead, that felt different from any property he had ever been on, And when she asked him what he meant, he said he thought it was because the land had been fully loved, that you could feel it in the way everything was arranged and tended, that it had the quality of a place that mattered deeply to the person who kept it. She thought about that for a long time after he said it. In Denver, the territorial attorney's office received their documentation with more interest than Sadie had expected, which was itself an indication that Marcus Webb had come to official attention before through other means. The attorney, a dry and meticulous man named Homestead, spent 2 hours with the documents and asked 3 rounds of clarifying questions, and then told them, in the measured language of someone managing his own excitement, that what they had brought him was sufficient to open a formal investigation into both Howard Kane and Marcus Webb, and that in the interim, he could issue an injunction preventing any sale or transfer of the Shepard property until the investigation was concluded. They walked out of the attorney's office into the Denver street on a cold, gray February afternoon, and Sadie had to stop walking for a moment because her legs were not entirely steady under her, and Stephen Keller put his hand on her arm, just briefly, just for a second, and then moved it away and looked at the street in front of them with the careful composure of a man who was dealing with something he hadn't entirely planned for. "It's over," she said. She meant the threat to the land. But the words felt larger than that, as though she were talking about more than one kind of danger. "The investigation will take time," he said, careful as always with precision. "But yes, the essential threat is over." She turned to look at him, and the Denver street was busy around them, horses and wagons and the shouts of vendors and the particular noise of a territorial capital city, and none of it touched the specific quiet that seemed to exist in the 2 feet of space between her and Stephen Keller. "Thank you," she said, "for coming with me." "You didn't need me to," he said, and it was not a dismissal but an acknowledgement, an accurate and considered recognition of her capability. "No," she agreed, "but I wanted you to." The silence after that was different from all the careful silences before it. They had dinner at a restaurant that evening, a proper one, the best in Denver by the standard of 1881, with linen tablecloths and candles and food that neither of them encountered regularly in their daily lives, and over that dinner and a bottle of wine that was better than anything available within 100 miles of Prospect Creek, the careful professional distance finally, irrevocably, dissolved. Not dramatically, not with a declaration or a scene. It dissolved the way ice does in spring, so gradually that you can't identify the exact moment when water replaced it, and then suddenly there's no ice left at all and you can't imagine the river any other way. He talked about Texas. Not the shaped and functional version of his history that she had heard before, but the real version. The fear he had mentioned in December opened up into something fuller, the specific texture of growing up poor and watched and uncertain, the way he had carried a dark past as a kind of fuel for years, burning it for warmth while it burned him back. And the slow and difficult process of learning to want something because it was good rather than because he needed to prove something to the ghost of a man who would never see it. She talked about her mother, the fever, and the days before and after, and what it meant to grow up motherless in the territory where women's work and women's knowledge were so often the difference between a homestead functioning and failing. She talked about the particular loneliness of being a woman who knew she was capable of more than the territory's social conventions allowed her to demonstrate. The way she had redirected that frustration into the horses, because the horses did not care about conventions, only about honesty and consistency, and the quality of attention you brought to them. "You're the most remarkable person I've encountered in this territory," he said, and the words were simple and direct and had no performance in them whatsoever. "You're considerably more than I expected," she said, which was her version of the same thing. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers, unhurried and deliberate, the way he did everything, and Sadie looked down at their hands and felt something unlock in her chest that she had been keeping carefully sealed for a very long time. They did not kiss that night. They were both too careful for that, too aware of the ground they were walking on and what it meant and what it could become. But they walked back to their boarding houses through the February cold of Denver with their arms touching occasionally, and they said good night at the corner of the street where their routes diverged. And there was a moment at that corner that lasted exactly as long as it lasted and was entirely wordless, and then they each went to their respective door. The journey back to the ranch took 4 days. It felt like 4 hours. Spring came to the Colorado Territory the way it always did, with mud and false warmth, and then more cold, and then, finally, in late April, the true turning, the grass coming up green and the creek running high with snowmelt, and the horses restless with the particular energy of animals who have been confined by winter and can suddenly smell the season changing. Sadie's life had changed in ways that were still catching her by surprise. The investigation in Denver moved forward through February and March, and by April, both Howard Kane and Marcus Webb were under formal territorial charges. Kane had resigned from the Colorado Territorial Bank. Webb had left the territory entirely, though Homestead's office indicated he had not gone far enough to escape jurisdiction. The injunction protecting Sadie's land remained in place, and by every legal measure the threat to the homestead was finished. The arrangement with Stephen Keller continued, unchanged in its terms and changed in every other way. He came to the homestead 3 times a week now rather than twice a month, and the visits were still primarily about the horses, because the horses were genuinely the primary professional purpose, but they were also about something else that neither of them was avoiding anymore. They had supper together on the evenings he came. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. He fixed the north fence post that had been giving her trouble all winter, not because she asked him to, but because he noticed it was compromised and he had the materials in his wagon, and the work took 20 minutes. She made him a birthday cake in March, having learned his birthday from a casual reference he made in conversation, and the look on his face when she brought it out was the look of a man who had not been made a birthday cake since childhood and did not entirely know what to do with the feeling it produced. She knew exactly what to do with it. She filed it away next to all the other things she had noticed and kept and thought about in the quiet hours. The declaration, when it came, was his, and it came in May, on a warm evening when the apple trees her mother had planted along the south fence had come into full blossom, and the whole property smelled like something from a story. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which was something they had fallen into as a routine without ever discussing it, the two of them in the wooden chairs her father had built, watching the mountains go pink and then purple in the west, and Keller set his coffee cup down on the railing and turned to look at her with the full, direct attention that she had come to understand was his version of saying something important. "I am not good at the kind of conversation I am apparently about to have," he said. "I know," Sadie said. "Neither am I. Say it anyway." He looked at the mountains for a moment, then back at her. "I have spent 15 years building something that was supposed to make me feel safe," he said. "And it did, or I thought it did. And then I saw a woman ride through my gate on a horse so extraordinary it seemed impossible, and she looked at me like she was the one doing me a favor by considering my offer, and in about 40 minutes she completely rearranged everything I thought I knew about what was worth wanting." Sadie felt her heart doing something it had no business doing. "I'm not asking anything of you that disrupts what we've built," he said. "The contract stands on its own terms. Your land is your land. Nothing changes if you tell me this is not something you want. But I have never been a man who can pretend something is not true because it is inconvenient. And what is true is that I am in love with you, Sadie Shepard, and have been for a while now, and I thought you deserved to hear it said plainly." The apple blossoms were coming off the trees in the warm May wind, drifting across the porch in a way that was almost theatrical in its beauty, and Sadie looked at this man who had appeared in her worst moment and treated her not as a problem to be solved or a transaction to be managed, but as an equal, As someone whose intelligence and skill and strength he had recognized immediately and never tried to diminish. And she thought about her father and his quiet certainty that the best things came to people who had the honesty to face them clearly. "I have been in love with you since December," she said. "When you told me about your father and I understood that you had been frightened in the same way I had been frightened and had chosen the same way through it, I have been trying to be sensible about it ever since." He looked at her for a long moment. "How's that been going?" he said, and the smile that came with it was slow and warm and reached all the way to his eyes. "Terribly," she said. He reached over the arms of the chairs between them and took her hand. And this time it was not the brief, careful contact of the Denver street, but something that held, that said it was staying. That was the beginning of something rather than the careful testing of it. He leaned over and kissed her, and the apple blossoms kept falling, and the mountains turned the deepest purple of a Colorado evening behind them. And Sadie Shepard, who had kept herself together through 3 years of debt and drought and loss and loneliness, and the specific exhaustion of having to be capable all the time with no one to be capable alongside, let herself simply be present in the moment, which was extraordinary and good and entirely, exactly right. The summer of 1881 was the finest Sadie had experienced on the homestead. The debt was gone, the land was protected, the contract with the Keller operation was producing work she was proud of and income she could build on, and she was in love with a man who loved her back without reservation, and without any of the conditions or diminishments she had feared for years might come attached to the word. The legal proceedings against Kane and Webb concluded in August. Kane received a 2-year territorial sentence and a permanent ban from banking practice. Webb, who had been located in New Mexico Territory, was extradited and charged separately, receiving 3 years for his role in the fraudulent scheme. Sadie attended neither trial, having submitted her documentary evidence by written affidavit, and she received the news of the verdicts by post on a Tuesday afternoon, read the letters once, then put them in her strong box with the mortgage papers and the contract and the other documents that constituted the foundation of the life she had built, and went back to the barn where a young bay mare was waiting for the afternoon's lesson. Stephen Keller asked her to marry him in September. He did it in the barn, which was, Sadie thought, exactly right. Not in a restaurant or on a hilltop or at any of the picturesque locations the territory provided in abundance, but in the specific place where she was most completely herself, surrounded by horses and hay and the warm smell of animals and honest work. He had come by on a Thursday morning with a string of 3 new horses for her to assess, and after they had gone through each one and made notes and discussed training approaches with their usual focused professionalism, he had stopped in the middle of the barn aisle with both hands in his coat pockets, and that expression on his face that she had learned to read as the forerunner of something important. "I want to ask you something that I want you to know has no bearing whatsoever on the contract or the business arrangement," he said. "All right," she said. "Those terms stand regardless of your answer. I need you to believe that before you say anything." "Stephen," she said, "ask, will you marry me?" He was not carrying a ring. He would, she learned later, have a ring commissioned from a Denver jeweler in October, a simple band with a small topaz, because he had noticed once that her eyes were that particular amber shade, and he had held onto the observation for 5 months. But he asked her in the barn in September without a ring, because he did not want the question to wait for the preparation. "Yes," Sadie said, and she meant it with every part of herself, all the intelligent and independent and capable and fiercely private parts, and all the softer parts underneath those that she had been protecting so carefully for so long that she had almost forgotten they were there. They were married in November, in the small stone church in the nearest town, Prospect Falls, with a congregation of about 30 people, ranch hands and neighbors, and 2 women from town who had known Sadie's mother and wept for the beauty of it. Sadie wore her mother's dress, let out slightly at the shoulders because she was broader, and she had flowers from the dried arrangement she kept on the mantelpiece in winter, late-season wild asters preserved in the fall. Stephen wore his best suit and looked at her walking up the aisle with an expression that nobody in the church could mistake for anything other than what it was. The minister was brief and sensible, which they both appreciated. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken clearly and with complete intention. When he kissed her at the altar, the 30 people in the pews produced a collective sound of satisfaction that was somewhere between applause and a sigh. The ranch became, gradually and naturally, their ranch. Not through any change in legal title. Sadie was clear that the homestead remained in her name, and she would be transferring nothing of its legal standing, which Stephen supported entirely and without any wounded pride about it. But in the way of lived life, the practical daily intimacy of two people working the same land and sleeping under the same roof and planning the same future, it became theirs. He moved into the homestead rather than the other way around, because the homestead was closer to her horse training operation, and because the Keller ranch house was larger and better staffed, and did not need an owner in constant residence in the way that a smaller operation did. He brought his books, which filled the remaining empty shelf space and overflowed to a second set of shelves he built in the winter. He brought 3 particular horses from his own remuda that he had personal attachments to, including a gray gelding he'd had for 8 years named Scout, who was the most opinionated horse Sadie had ever met, and who took 3 weeks to decide he approved of her before becoming her devoted shadow in the pasture. They fell into the rhythms of shared life with a naturalness that surprised them both, as if the habits of 2 independent and self-sufficient people who had each spent years alone could somehow lock together rather than collide. They divided labor without assigning roles, each doing what they were best at, which meant Sadie ran the horse operation and kept the primary accounts and made decisions about the land management, and Stephen ran the cattle side and handled the larger-scale negotiations with buyers and suppliers and the increasingly relevant discussions with the railroad as it pushed closer to the territory. They disagreed sometimes because they were both intelligent and stubborn and had each been making their own decisions for long enough to have strong convictions about how things should be done. The disagreements were usually good ones, the kind that led somewhere useful, because neither of them was invested in winning so much as in being right, and they were generally capable of distinguishing between the two. There was one significant argument in their first winter together about water management on the shared pasture boundary, and it lasted 3 days and covered several related issues about operational integration and the question of whether certain decisions required mutual agreement or individual authority. And at the end of it, they had a clearer and more honest understanding of their partnership than they had achieved in the year before it. So Sadie privately considered it a productive argument, even though it had been, in the moment, genuinely difficult. The physical side of their love was something she had not known how to anticipate and found entirely surprising in the best possible way. She had been, by the nature of her isolated life and her particular focus, inexperienced, and she had expected that inexperience to produce awkwardness or uncertainty or worse, the need to perform emotions she was still learning. What she found instead was a man who was patient and unhurried and deeply attentive in the same way he was patient and unhurried and deeply attentive about everything else, and who seemed to understand instinctively that she needed to come to things at her own pace, and that it was not a deficiency but a quality, and who made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, that being fully known by another person was not a vulnerability but a gift. She told him once, in the quiet of a winter morning when the snow was coming down outside the window, and the room was warm and they had nowhere to be for hours, that she had not understood before him how much of herself she had been keeping in reserve against the possibility of having no one. He touched her face and did not say anything for a moment, and then he said that he knew that feeling better than almost any other, and that he planned to spend a very long time making it unnecessary. Spring of 1882 came, and Sadie found herself pregnant. She confirmed it with the doctor in Prospect Falls in March, a spare and practical man named Hollis who delivered the news with professional directness and a complete absence of sentiment, and she rode home in the cold spring rain thinking about it with the particular combination of joy and practical assessment that was her specific way of receiving large information. She was in good health. She was 27 years old. The homestead had, at this point, a clear debt-income base, 2 sound adults in full operation, and the infrastructure to support expansion. These were, from any analytical standpoint, favorable conditions. She told Stephen that evening at supper, setting down her fork and saying simply that she needed to share something, and then telling him directly. He went still in the way she had seen him go still once or twice before when he received something that was larger than his immediate processing capacity, and then something crossed his face that she had not seen there before, something open and unguarded and brilliant with feeling, and he got up from the table and came to where she was sitting and held her with both arms for a long moment without saying anything. "Are you afraid?" he asked her against her hair. "A little," she said honestly. "You?" "Considerably," he said, and she could feel his heart beating under her cheek, steady and fast. "Good," she said. "Then we're both paying attention." He laughed, low and warm, and pulled back to look at her face, and the expression on his was the one that still, after more than a year, made her chest do something she had never found the precise words for. The pregnancy was uncomplicated in medical terms, and complicated in every other way that first pregnancies tend to be. A steady accumulation of physical and emotional newness that Sadie navigated with the same methodical determination she brought to difficult horses. She kept working through the summer, adjusting her training activities as her body required it, delegating more of the physical groundwork to the 2 young men she had hired as assistants that spring. She kept her books and her contracts and her management of the business side of things without interruption. She read every book on the topic that was available through the Territorial Lending Library and wrote her questions down in a separate notebook. Stephen was, throughout all of it, exactly who she needed him to be, which was not someone who treated her differently or with excessive caution, or who made the pregnancy into a reason to expand his authority over decisions that were hers to make, but someone who was present and attentive and curious, and willing to do whatever specific and practical thing was actually needed at any given time. He learned to give back massages in the 3rd trimester because her back ached, and he did it without complaint or commentary every evening until the baby arrived. Their son was born in late November of 1882, delivered by Doc Hollis in the room they had made into a nursery, a healthy and indignant boy who arrived with a set of lungs that made the horses in the near corral lift their heads. They named him James Daniel Keller, James for no particular namesake, but because it suited him, Daniel for Sadie's father. She held him in the hours after his birth and looked at him with the particular shock of first meeting a person who has not existed before and now suddenly, completely does, and felt the full weight of her life up to that moment. The losses and the struggles and the fear and the love and the impossible negotiated deal that had started everything, converging into this room, this baby, this astonishing, ordinary evening. Stephen sat beside her on the bed with his back against the headboard and his arm around her shoulders and James Daniel in her arms, and outside the window the Colorado winter was doing what it did, vast and cold and indifferent and beautiful. And inside the room there was a lamp burning and a fire going, and a family existing, where 3 years ago there had been only a woman alone and a debt that should have swallowed her. "He looks like you," Stephen said. "He looks like a very small and angry person," Sadie said. "He definitely looks like you," Stephen said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself, for once in her life, rest completely. The years that followed were full ones. Sadie's horse training reputation grew, as it always had, through the most reliable mechanism available, which was the demonstrated performance of the horses she sent out into the territory. By 1884, she was turning away contracts she didn't have the capacity for, and by 1885, she had formalized the operation into the Shepard Horse Works, a name that appeared on correspondence and contracts, and the carved wooden sign she hung above the barn door with her own hands. The Keller Cattle Company and the Shepard Horse Works operated in formal partnership, and in practice were so intertwined that the distinction was more administrative than real. But Sadie maintained it deliberately because the distinction mattered to her, because the homestead and its name and its independence were the things she had fought the hardest for, and because she had built something with those 47 acres that was worth naming. In 1884, the railroad came through, close enough to matter, a stop at Prospect Falls 8 miles distant that transformed the economics of cattle and horse transportation in the region overnight. Stephen had been anticipating this for 2 years and had positioned the cattle operation accordingly, and the result was a significant expansion in their income and operational scale in the year that followed. They hired 3 more permanent hands and built a second barn, a large professional-grade structure with proper ventilation and stall design that Sadie had drawn the plans for herself over a winter evening at the kitchen table. The injustice of what Webb and Kane had done to her, and to the other homesteaders they had targeted before her, continued to find resolution through the territorial courts throughout this period. 2 other affected properties successfully pursued compensation claims on the basis of the fraudulent loan manipulation, using Sadie's documented case as the legal foundation. She testified by written affidavit in both cases and wrote once to the territorial attorney's office to say, without drama, that she hoped the precedent was useful, and received back a carefully professional letter that contained between its lines a clear and genuine respect. James Daniel Keller grew from an indignant newborn into a small person of remarkable determination and curiosity, with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's way of looking at things from 7 different angles before committing to a conclusion. By the time he was 2, he was already fearless around the horses, which Sadie observed with both pride and vigilance, taking him into the barn on her hip and narrating everything she was doing in the low, steady voice she used with the animals, because she had found that the language of horses worked as well on small children, clarity and patience, and the consistent communication of safety. Absalom, who was now 7 years old and as magnificent as ever, was James Daniel's particular favorite. The black stallion, who had been trained to such a level of trust and communication that he was essentially a different category of animal from the average horse, showed a particular gentleness around the boy that was not instinct but something more specific, a recognition and a choice. Sadie watched this and felt things she could not have said out loud without crying. In 1885, on a warm September evening that was almost exactly 4 years from the day she had ridden to the Keller spread with a foreclosure notice in her pocket, and everything she had ever built on the line, Sadie sat on the porch in the wooden chair her father had made and watched the mountains go through their evening colors, and thought about the deal she had negotiated in the teeth of an impossible situation. The contract had been honored on both sides without exception. Its 5-year term would conclude the following year, and in the months before it did, she and Stephen had discussed the renegotiation that the original terms had specified. They had discussed it once over supper with the ease of 2 people who had already settled every relevant question between them long before it needed to be put on paper. "What do you want the new terms to be?" he had asked her. "Partnership," she had said. "Equal and permanent, not contractor and client. Not advance and repayment. Full business partnership defined with each of our individual operations retained independently and the joint work governed by the partnership agreement." "That is exactly what I was going to propose," he said. "I know," she said. He had smiled at her across the supper table with the particular warmth that she had been collecting like currency for 4 years. saving each instance because they were, individually and collectively, the most valuable things she owned. The 5-year contract concluded in October of 1886, right on schedule, and the partnership agreement they signed in its place was drafted by the same territorial attorney who had handled the original. Now a man of comfortable acquaintance who had watched this particular arrangement evolve with what he described, in his professional language, as considerable interest. The document was clean and fair and balanced and said exactly what they meant, and they both signed it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon, while James Daniel sat on the floor with Scout the Gray Gelding's head in his lap, which was a thing that happened regularly now, because the horse had appointed himself the boy's guardian in a way that no one had asked for and everyone had accepted. That same October, Sadie told Stephen she was pregnant again. This time the news arrived with less of the shocked stillness of the first time, and more of the immediate practical conversation of people who had been through it before, followed by the same warmth underneath everything, the same feeling of life expanding in directions that continued to surprise them. Their second child, a daughter this time, arrived in June of 1887, red-faced and fierce from the first moment, with Sadie's dark hair and a disposition that the doc described as vigorous. They named her Clara Rose Keller, Clara for the simplicity of it and Rose because she arrived in June when Sadie's mother's rose bushes along the south fence were in full bloom, and it seemed right. The homestead in the summer of 1887 was a thing Sadie sometimes stopped to look at with the complete awareness of someone who knows the full weight of what they are seeing. The barn with its new extension and its carved sign. The horses in the pasture, her horses, a string of them that bore her training in every line of their movement. The house with its 2 sets of boots at the door, and its overflowing bookshelves, and its smell of coffee and horses and wood smoke and lavender soap from the sachet, she still put in the linen closet in memory of her mother. James Daniel in the near corral, 4.5 years old, standing on the lower fence rail to watch Absalom, and the black horse watching him back with those dark thinking eyes. Clara Rose on a blanket in the yard, newly capable of sitting up on her own and deeply interested in everything within reach. Stephen came up behind her as she stood watching, and she felt his hand at her back, warm and familiar. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about the day I rode to your gate," she said. "With a foreclosure notice in my pocket and nothing but a horse and an argument. The best argument I ever heard," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "You didn't look it." "I know." He turned to look at him. "I needed you not to see it." He touched her face in the way he did, with both hands with full attention, and his eyes were that dark gray that she had never found an adequate word for. "I need you to know something," he said. "Tell me. Every good thing in my life since that October morning is because you rode through my gate and told me what you wanted and showed me what you could do," he said. "The land and the business and all of it, those are good things, but those are not what I mean. I mean the rest of it, the way I understand the world now, the way I understand myself. You changed what was possible for me, Sadie, not by saving me from something, by making me want something worth having." She was quiet for a moment, and the afternoon light fell across the land around them, all 47 acres of it, gold and green and alive, and the horses were moving in the pasture in that unhurried way they did on warm afternoons, and James Daniel had convinced Absalom to lower his head enough for a 4-year-old hand to touch his nose, which was a miracle that happened daily and never got less miraculous. "You know what the best part of that deal was?" She said. "The water rights," he said, and she could hear that he was smiling without looking at him. "The water rights were very reasonable," she said, "but no. The best part was that I went there to negotiate for the ranch, and I came home with you." He kissed her, in the afternoon light of the homestead that was fully, completely theirs, and the mountains stood behind them as they always had, vast and permanent and indifferent to the small human business of being in love, but present for it anyway, which was, she had always thought, the thing mountains did best. 3 years later, the partnership had grown into something that other ranchers in the territory pointed to as a model, not just because it was financially successful, which it was, substantially so, but because it worked in the particular way that things built on honest foundations work, with a durability that absorbed difficulty without breaking, and an adaptability that let it change when change was required. The horse training operation had expanded to include a regional training program for other ranchers' hands, Sadie teaching the communication methods she used to anyone willing to spend 3 days learning them, which produced a satisfaction in her that was different from the satisfaction of training the horses themselves, but equal in its way. She had written everything down over those years, not for publication but for herself, and for James Daniel and Clara Rose, and for whoever came after them. The training methods, the horse vocabulary she had developed, the systematic approach to animal communication that she had built from her father's foundation and her own 20-plus years of observation. It was. A Denver journalist who heard about it through the territorial attorney wrote her in 1890, the kind of knowledge that deserved to be wider than one ranch in Colorado, and would she consider allowing a published account. She considered it for 2 weeks, talking it through with Stephen in the evenings, and then she wrote back and said yes, with conditions, which were that the publication would credit her by full name and professional title, that the practical content would be reviewed by her for accuracy before print, and that a portion of any proceeds would go to the Territorial Fund for Frontier Homestead Protection that had been established in the aftermath of the Cain Webb investigation. The journalist agreed to all 3 conditions, and the resulting monograph, published in 1891, was modest in scope but precise in content, and went into 3 printings over the following 5 years. In the year it was published, Sadie was 36 years old, and she stood in front of her barn on a September morning holding a copy of the printed monograph and thinking about the terrified 26-year-old who had sat at a table with a foreclosure notice and a ledger, and refused to accept that she had run out of options. She had not run out of options. She had negotiated an impossible deal, and the deal had given her the ranch and the partner and the children, and the work and the life that the ranch had always been pointing toward, and none of it would have existed if she had not ridden 12 miles in the cold with her best horse and her best argument and the absolute refusal to be defeated. Stephen came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and he looked at the monograph in her hands, and the expression on his face was the one she still, 10 years on, could not entirely prepare herself for, the one that contained the full weight of how he saw her, with the same shock and depth of impression that had appeared the first time he watched her work in the corral, never diminished, only deepened. "How does it feel?" he asked. She looked at the barn, at her sign above the doors. At James Daniel, nearly 9 years old now, moving through the horses in the paddock with the instinct that had been coming since before he could walk. At Clara Rose, 4 years old, sitting on the porch steps watching her brother with fierce attention. At the mountains, at the creek line where the cottonwoods were turning gold, at the ranch that had been her mother's dream and her father's work and her own fought for truth. She thought about betrayal and dark pasts and forced choices and the hidden motives of men who had tried to take what she had built, and she thought about how all of it had folded, eventually, into this morning, this yard, this coffee in her hands and this man beside her. "It feels," she said, "like exactly what it is." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the cottonwoods along Prospect Creek went on shedding their gold into the autumn air the way they had for every year of her life and every year before it, and the homestead stood as it had always stood, in the full light of a Colorado morning, solid and earned and permanent and theirs.